before I give time to him, let me just introduce Lenin in one or two sentences. Okay, Vladimir Lenin, he was a revolutionarist. Okay, the first constitutionally formed Marxist Communist Party leader. Okay, he was not just a revolutionary. He was also a thinker, a theorist, a writer. Okay, in fact, he was very, very relevant. So relevant that he made a variation of Marxism, okay, and call it Leninism. Okay, I give time to Suddhabrata Debroy now. Thank you, sir, and we hope that we'll have a very, very healthy and meaningful discussion. After the presentation, we'll have a discussion session. Students and participants, please be ready with questions. Thank you very much, sir. I give the time to you.
Hi, everybody. Don't call me sir, please. I'm very junior to a lot of people who are present over here. Okay. Yeah, just getting on to the topic immediately, like without doing much of an ado. I'm Suddhabrata Debroy. I'm a doctorate scholar in the Department of Sociology, Gender Studies and Criminology in the University of Otago here in New Zealand. And my primary research interest, like the topics that I write upon, are Marxist theory and Marxist politics, along with gender studies and crime and victimology as well. Some of my research interests have also dealt with cultural Marxism, as well as unorthodox, specifically very unorthodox Marxism as well. Okay, so it is from this perspective that I will be looking at Lenin and the question of dialectics within Lenin, which is more specifically based upon his ideas and his explorations into Hegel's Science of Logic that Lenin wrote back in 1914 to 15. One of the immediate points which comes to mind is clarifying that Lenin had a very important philosophical notebook, which was known as Lenin's Hegel notebooks. It hasn't received much attention in the academic world as well as in the activist world to a certain extent because of 3 or 4 reasons primarily that I see. One of the basic reasons was that it wasn't there are not many commentaries available on that in English. Most of the commentary, most of the influential commentary at least, that happened in the late 60s and 70s when that was published in its German edition, was taking place in French. There was a book in Italian, but there wasn't much commentary available on that on English. So basically, that's why I think that's one of the primary reasons why we fail to see Lenin as a highly influential and highly sort of sophisticated academic as well. And most of the times we end up reducing him to some sort of merely political or politically essentialist figure whose only goal was to achieve power. But Lenin's legacy, especially from somebody like me who believes that Marxist theory is based on the primacy of dialectics, Hegelian dialectics to be precise, it's a work in progress even for me. And so if you consider that, I think there are some very important explorations to be important discussions and explorations in this regard to be done, especially in the case of Lenin's excavation into Hegel's Science of Logic and other theories of Hegel as well. Now, to begin, I think it's important to also classify that it's highly relevant and highly important to separate out different Lenins. Like in the case of Marx, whenever we talk about Marx, we actually make a difference between the young Marx, the sort of middle-aged Marx, if it can be called middle-aged, yeah, then the late Marx. There are different distinctions between young Marx and late Marx. There are problems about how does the young Marx approach the revolution? How does the late Marx approach the revolution of a working class revolution? How does the young Marx approach questions of Hegelian idealism or questions of materialism? And how does the late Marx engage with those? So there are differences. Similar is the case of Lenin. One of the major blind spots that I see of academic Marxism and even of political Marxism or political Marxism is a different school in itself. But if we talk about Marxist ideas in politics, there is a difference uh, we, we very often make a difference between young and late Marx, but somehow when it comes to Lenin, we are often grabbed with the idea that Leninism means one single stream of thought, one undialectical, very homogeneous, uniform single stream of thought, which the final goal of which is to achieve a working class revolution, which in my opinion is highly reductionist in nature. It totally devalues the contributions of a person who has dealt immensely within the question of dialectics and Hegel's science of logic, etc., etc. Lenin's notebooks, if we see Lenin's writings on Hegel, Lenin talks a lot about in terms of his focus on philosophy and his ideas against the problems of crude materialism, or what we call blatant objectivity. Like there is no individual doesn't matter, everything will fall into a pattern, basically was what we mean by positivistic methodology. So Lenin in his early years might have succumbed to crude materialism, but if we see his writings post 1910, especially the ones those are very close to 1917, we get a hugely relevant idea of Hegel and how he approached the impending proletarian revolution in Africa. He read Hegel's Science of Logic, and also he talks about how it is necessary. He made a statement back in 1914 that in order to understand Marx, it's very important to read Hegel. And if we don't read Hegel, or if we don't have an idea of Hegel, our knowledge of Marxism remains incomplete to a certain extent. And this is in stark contrast to what we know today, that Marx basically refuted Hegelian dialectics, Marx made it stand up on its head, etc., this everything. Now, I'm not saying that these claims are wrong. These claims are partly correct as well, but these claims have a certain ambiguity with them as well. And that is the domain, I think, where sociologists, philosophers, political scientists, students of politics, organization theories, it's highly relevant, even history students to be there, it's highly relevant to study that ambiguous portion, that what if Marx did make it stand up on its head, but what if there was a certain ambiguity on how he did it? And that is the domain that Lenin actually traversed in my opinion. Now, Lenin, there are certain important contributions of a Leninist dialectic. One of them is that he established the centrality of the dialectic proper, as Hegel called it. Dialectic proper is a philosophical science which is very different than all other post-Marx Marxists. He did not engage with a highly positivistic philosophy of dialectics, or very positive, very mechanistic philosophy of dialectics, but rather he understood that as history progresses, there might be contingencies in place, there might be certain contingencies which might arise until suddenly, which have to be dealt with as and when time and history, time, place, and space permits. He spent a lot of time on Hegel's doctrine of notion as well, something which I wouldn't go into details because that would take a whole different lecture as well. So, yeah, one of the cases that I might make it clear is that there is an immense history of how this documentary evidence was collected regarding Lenin's Hegel notebooks. It's highly unlikely that people will find it in one particular space, but if anybody wants to look at it, one of the most influential books on or works on this has been done by Raya Dunaveskaya, as well as Grace Lee Boggs, C.L.R. James, in recent times, Kevin Anderson, Peter Hoodis, who remain very dear friends of mine till this date. And it's through them that I got introduced to this idea of Lenin as a hugely influential dialectician. And I think that's one of the areas that even in India, or in terms of Indian popular struggles, it becomes very important, because it talks a lot about contradiction, and it talks a lot about Hegel's theory of self-movement rather than merely abstract movement, but rather a self-movement which again can help us relate back to the concept of what Gramsci was talking about when he talked about hegemony and hegemonical dominance, similarly to the state of, in a very critical, unorthodox manner, even to Althusser for that matter. And Althusser was talking about ideological state apparatuses and repressive state apparatuses and so on and so on. Now, when Lenin was writing about all this, he was influenced by two or three fundamental things that those were happening during those period of time. One was that capitalism was going into a crisis. Second thing, the First World War was on. It was like literally the world was on fire, basically. The third thing which was happening, if you understand, if that was happening, was there was a collapse of the established left, what we call as a formal organized left, because there was something called the uh, Zimmer World Conference, which had happened. The Third International was still in its infancy. Like the idea of forming the Third International was still in its infancy. People like Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin, everybody, because till then there was no opposition. There was not much opposition between Stalin and Trotsky, because everybody was sort of overshadowed with the idea of Lenin being there and leading the revolution. And this kind of things sort of started cropping up. These factors sort of led to this method. And the first sort of dialectical statement that Lenin made, in my opinion, and in people who engage with this topic, is that when Lenin said, turn the imperialist war into a civil war during the First World War, that was one of the primary initiators of Lenin's sort of dialectical mode of thinking. And that was what I think he gained immensely from studying Hegel. Lenin's idea of, if I guess people here, since it's a sociology departmental talk, so people here are familiar with what Max Weber called ideal types. So for Lenin, the ideal type of Max Weber, of course, he didn't quote Max Weber, but for Lenin, the ideal type of Max Weber was not something which just existed in theory. It was rather something which had to be achieved, but rather which can be achieved. If we look at recent commentaries made on Lenin, especially by people like Slavoj Žižek or Paul LeBlanc and everybody who are reputed Lenin scholars, or who are reputed Lenin scholars, or you can call them who are experts on Lenin, actually say this. They don't exactly relate it to dialectics that much, in my opinion, but they actually, by focusing on this idea, they draw this conclusion that one of the primary emphasis and primary achievements of Lenin was that he brought a Marxist idea from a deep abyss of negativity that it was there. And I'm not saying negativity in a Hegelian sense, but a deep idea of pessimism that had grappled world Marxism. And Lenin sort of brought it out and threw it out in the open in sort of an affirmative social movement. And that was Lenin's main contribution. As Kevin Anderson informs us, that Lenin's idea was that the difference between the ideal and the material is not something which is unconditional and boundless, but rather it's something which can be achieved, and which can be achieved through a proper dialectical revolution. That was Lenin's thought. Because and Kevin Anderson is he is one of the precursors of this theory of Hegelian Leninism, or if we talk about Lenin and Hegel and the interrelationship between them, he draws from scholars like C.L.R. James, Raya Dunayevskaya, Grace Lee Boggs, and all these other people who were during that time who were deviated from the orthodox left, and were talking in terms of how we can make Hegel more relevant within contemporary times. And from there on, this idea came about that Lenin was not exactly talking about mere movement. Lenin was rather talking about the self-movement, or the self-conscious movement of the proletariat in Russia. He was not somebody who was directly, abjectly advocating for a very sort of directed amount of movement, but rather he was talking in terms of that the working class should take power. Of course, there are very deep contradictions about this as well, which are evident if somebody quotes what he said in What Is to Be Done and everything else. But for me, as well as other people who engage with this topic, the main sort of the primary basis of Lenin's dialectical thoughts can be seen in his studies on imperialism, national liberation movements, as well as his most famous book, State and Revolution. And I will get to that in a bit as well, how State is Revolution is an immensely dialectical text rather than just a mere theory of revolution as well. He focused a lot on Hegel's law of contradiction, which was basically dealt upon that there are, in every stage of history, there is something called inner contradiction, and that has to be, and that sort of provides the bridge towards the next destination in history. And it is not something that can be defined as a steady flow of history or anything other than that. In Hegel's Science of Logic, like at least in my reading, there is a centrality of contradictions, which becomes a characteristic of an Hegelian essence. And that identity rather just determines what our determination of our immediate being. Lenin's notes sort of focus on this relationship between how we deal with this kind of problems ideally as well as materialism, and this sort of tries to bring sort of bridge the gap between idealism and materialism. He doesn't actually take the side of idealism. Like he was heavily opposed to Kantian idealism or Kantian dualism, or even for the Hegelian idealism, but he was also opposed to crude vulgar materialism as well. And he made a statement, especially if somebody looks at his 1922 text that's on militant movements, and he talks about this theory of on the significance of militant materialism. That's why that was a 1922 text where he actually said that Marxism is actually, it cannot be reduced to something like a natural science. It's not a very highly natural science because it can't be reduced to strict laws. But rather, because if we do that, then we automatically land ourselves in the trouble of sort of being in that blind spot where, if in the case of bourgeois invasion through dominant ideas or hegemonical inversions, or if somebody considers the present world order that's highly mediated, discourse controlled world, it lands us in a bit of a bit of a trouble if we consider Marxism to be a natural science, because at this point of time, new theories have to be developed, new strategies have to be developed, and that is something that can be only developed if we think about Marx and Marxism theory in terms of what Marx said in his Paris manuscripts of 1844, and specifically interpret it in a more humanist way, which talks a lot about this relationship between objectivity and subjectivity, but like instead of seeing them as two different things, because we have to accept this idea that under 21st century, there is a huge dominance of individual subjectivity as well as material objectivity. And somehow, if we don't sort of bring both these ideas into consonance with each other and take both of them forward, the impending working class revolution might be a dream just too far ahead, at least in the present situation. Along with this, it must also be considered the experiences that Lenin had when he was writing about dialectics, or when he was writing about national liberation movements. If somebody looks at his debates about his debates with his debates especially focusing on the Baku Congress or the Third International Debates. I remember a few years ago, Lefebvre Publications published a book, a collection of documents on national liberation struggles, and that also contains documentary evidence regarding the conversations which went on between Vladimir Lenin and Manovendranath Roy, who was from India. And that remains a very interesting debate, because M.N. Roy, as you all know, he went on to found a school which is today called Radical Humanism. So that debate sort of is an interesting point of view, but yeah, that's a discussion for another time. If we talk about how have people interpreted Lenin and his idea of dialectics, we can again go back to documentary evidences done by a lot of scholars that I've already mentioned: Anderson, Dunayevsky, and other people, Peter Hood is among them, who have done a tremendous lot of work on this on that period of Lenin's life, 1914 to 1923. If we look about Lenin, Lukács specifically, and Lukács, his most famous book is History and Class Consciousness. But if we go about understanding what sort of transcending from Lukács' history of class consciousness and talk more about his book on Lenin, that's Lenin, a study in the unity of his thought. Lukács actually, one of the main problems with Lukács' definition of Lenin, in my opinion, is that he reduces Lenin to this organizational master and he just reduces the entire philosophical or Marxist revolutionary outlook of Lenin to just an understanding of how Lenin interpreted organization, which is a reductionist thing to do. But that is why at times he downgrades the importance of how important Lenin was as a dialectician, but rather he focuses on practicality more and how does theory interpret practice, etc., etc. And those are some of the things that I think we need to focus on. But Lenin's Hegel notebooks, especially in the terms of Lukács or other people who have written about them, except the exception of Kevin Anderson, they have rather talked more about those as biographical sketches. Some of them have even interpreted those as just somebody who was reading, just reading stuff and commenting and summarizing those as well. A similar fate was initiated to Marx's Grundrisse and Marx's ethnological notebooks as well, when this became clear that something of that sort existed. But we all know that with time, the Grundrisse became a very important text of this entire corpus of Marxist paradigm, be it in sociology, philosophy, politics, you name it. So, according to Lenin, intelligent idealism is highly closer to intelligent materialism than stupid materialism. Like, that means if we think properly in a if we think subjectively about a situation in a revolutionary way, that probably is more closer to revolutionary objectivity than sort of if we think in a very vague, crudely objective manner in a situation. And this was actually one of the fundamental points that most of critical Lenin scholars actually make, that regarding objectivity and subjectivity within Lenin, because one of the problems which immediately crop up is that if this thing has happened, then why did these problems occur with the Soviet Union if the theory was correct, and all that this entire discourse about Soviet versus anti-Soviet policies and discourse. Yeah. So proceeding for that, there was a French Marxist by the name of Henri Lefebvre. And Henri Lefebvre, although his most famous theories remain about urban space and about everyday life and critique of everyday life, but Henri Lefebvre also wrote a short book in French on Lenin, which has never been translated. So whatever I'm saying is, so whatever I'll be talking about, that book, those are actually drawn from secondary sources who have translated them on their own. So what Lefebvre and Guterman, who were both at that point of time members of the Communist Party in France, PCF, and they actually said that when we read through Lenin's Hegel notebooks, we see a huge progress from the Lenin of materialism and empiro-criticism that Lenin wrote in 1908. And 1914, Hegel's notebooks came about 6 years after that. So they actually interpreted that as a huge advance of thought, because at that point of time, it sort of provided a bridge between theory and praxis, which obviously remains people who are into social activism or who research about social activism are quite familiar with this, that there is always a sort of dualism between theory and practice. There are comments are made that whatever happens in theory might not happen in praxis, and praxis might not be sort of important in the case of theory. So, and these were some of the things that Hegelian Marxism tries to sort of bridge and create sort of synthesis between these ideas. The Hegelian Marxism, which comes from Lenin, actually it talks about the self movement of humanity and nature. It doesn't actually believe in dualism. There is no sort of orthodox wall between theory and practice, but rather it's a dialectical relationship. It's an unity of finite and infinite social objectives. That's what becomes clear when we are talking about Max Weber's ideal types and all this kind of theories. And rather it talks about, and it always leads us towards a direction where we can think about in terms of the total man. Like that's a Hegelian term, to be exact. It's a total human being who is at ease, or at will, or at in complete solidarity, in complete consonance with his environment, with his. And in terms of men, I'm also referring to women, because these are essentially German texts. So men basically in German means Mensch, and that sort of translates into human beings rather than male or female. So yeah, that's just evading the controversy which might arise. It witnesses practice, and it witnesses praxis, or the question of praxis, as connected to interaction between man and nature. And this has become one of the, I think, with the impending climate change, that's why I think there is an increasing discussion on Hegelian Marxism today, because of this ideas about climate change, those are flowing, and how Hegelian Marxism's idea of praxis can actually provide a solution towards that, because Hegelian Marxism actually talks about this unity of man and nature, which, like, sadly or ironically, some of the other variants don't exactly talk about that. The problem with one of the major problems that I see with 20th century Marxism, or like even 21st century Marxism, whatever we have had till now, is that it tries to solve a lot of philosophical or theoretical problems in practice, thinking that contradictions might dissolve themselves in practice. But I see that as a very deterministic kind of notion. But rather, if we don't think of theory and practice being in a dialectical relationship with each other, that is always going to be a problem. There is always going to be a huge sort of issue with that, because we'll inevitably end up in certain senses of determinism, certain senses of reductionism, etc., etc. Herbert Marcuse, when he was writing about Lenin, he evoked one of the statements that Lenin's Marxism was not based on dialectics as a methodology, but he didn't say that dialectics as methodology. That's my interpretation, that it is not based on dialectics as methodology, but rather, as Marcuse says, it's something based on a dialectical methodology. That means your dialectics is not only a part of your methodology, but rather your methodology itself is dialectical in nature. And it's a very philosophical terrain to go into, but I think it's a very important terrain for us in this present juncture. One of the other texts that I was talking about is a State and Revolution and the Centrality of Contradiction, because for people who have read State and Revolution, especially when Lenin is talking about the state and its differences with anarchists, he's constantly talking about that you resolve one contradiction. For example, you achieve a socialist revolution or a statist socialist revolution. Somebody gets into power and you basically have a socialist or a communist government in the state. That doesn't mean your contradictions are over, but rather the importance of that event philosophically in a Marxian sense, or sociologically in a Marxian sense, is that event leads us back to another contradiction, and that contradiction leads us back to another contradiction, and so on and so on. So the question of dialectics lives on, and the question of contradictions lives on. There is a certain amount of criticality within revolutionary thought, and that criticality today has to be reinvented or re-engaged with. I'm not very fond of this idea of reinventing philosophers. I much rather use the word re-engaging with philosophers. So in this kind of senses, Lenin's dialectics was a highly original in nature. It was a philosophical foundation, and this is uh, Raya Dunevskaya's conclusion after she translated all of Lenin's Hegel's abstracts of Hegel's notebooks, that it was a highly original dialectical philosophy. It was a philosophical foundation for most of the post 1914 writings of Lenin, which included State and Revolution and some of the most fundamental texts of Lenin that we take today. It was one of the initiator of Hegelian Marxism that we talk about in terms of, if we talk about sort of other people which followed after Lenin, like Lukács, Marcuse, in the present modern times, Slavoj Žižek, who talks a lot about Hegel and Marx. And most importantly, it re-established sort of that idea that Marxism is not exactly a stale sort of dogmatic theory, but rather Marxism is a living body of ideas and living body of sort of theories which should be engaged with and which should be sort of put into the front, especially when we are talking about a proletarian revolution. Dialectics, as Lenin shows us, is a teaching that shows, and I'm quoting from Lenin here, that dialectics is the teaching which shows how opposites can be and how they happen to be identical, under what conditions they are identical, become transformed into one another, why the human mind should grasp this becoming transformed into one another. And this was his sort of, and these are reprinted in his collected works as well. If somebody has access to collected works, these are Lenin collected works, volume 38. I'm not sure of the page number, but probably it should be around 108 to 100 and somewhere around that. So, and 20th century Marxism has certain very interesting ideas to understand from Lenin's conception of dialectics and Lenin and the relevance of Hegel today. Is that one of the important ideas that immediately comes to mind is this centrality, that your dialectical contradictions remain. Dialectical contradictions don't just go unless and until you establish what Marx sort of talked about in terms of in his 1844 economic and philosophical manuscripts, famously known as Paris manuscripts, this realization of the complete species man, or the universal human being, or the total man of Hegel. Dialectics contradiction, the centrality of self-contradiction or contradictions remains within Marxist thought, and that will remain within all the analysis of philosophy, no matter how we analyze it. And those are some of the ideas that I think are central, very central to contemporary analysis of popular struggles as well, especially if we consider the current crisis over citizenship amendment, or the current crisis about COVID. What happens once COVID is gone? What happens, for example, if India tomorrow just sufficiently deals with COVID, or sufficiently gets done with COVID, it defeats the huge surge of cases? What happens? Does the contradiction go away? No, the contradiction doesn't go away, but rather it leads us back to a new contradiction. And it leads us back to a new contradiction, and that contradiction, once it leads us back to a contradiction of health, and then and so on and so on. I wouldn't like to elaborate on that too much here. But yeah, so one of my understanding of dialectics, or my conception of the importance of Lenin as a revolutionary figure, is that he established this idea that dialectics was central to Marxist philosophy. Again, no matter how much we actually sort of push this into obscurity and sort of stuff, because materialism, regarding crude materialism, the greatest sort of quality of Lenin was that he actually was a highly self-critical person. He actually said at one point of time, he made a statement, or he wrote in a paper that I'm not saying that crude materialism is bad. I'm not quoting verbatim. This is my understanding of it, that he said that I'm not saying that crude materialism is bad. It is good. It can be good, especially if we counter sort of creationist tendencies or creationist ideas, crude materialism is what we need. The problem is crude materialism isn't sufficient. And that is something I think, especially when we are talking about revolutions in present, in modern day, especially in the 21st century, when we are talking about revolutions and working class revolutions, contradictions, what's happening in and around us. So that is why I think we need to critically evaluate Lenin, learn from the mistakes that Lenin committed, make sure that we don't commit those mistakes, and also focus on his ideas of what I think we can call dialectic proper, and what we can learn from Lenin's conception of the revolution, Lenin's conception of dialectics. And for this, we need to go back to original writings of Lenin and what Lenin actually talked about dialectics and all those other kind of things which comes about. There are certain sort of important points that Lenin makes, especially in terms of his imperialism, where he critiques the entire concept of imperialism as a concept. We need to sort of critique imperialism or critique capitalism as concepts first, rather than just seeing them as immediates. Because yeah, immediate struggles are important, but then we have to we have to understand that there is a bigger goal in place here, and that bigger goal, in my opinion, can only be understood if we consider that the totality is in a dialectical relationship with the particularity. That, in the words of one of the people who had the most influences on me, Henry Lefebvre, so he talks about this dialectics between totality and particularity, and that is something that I think we need to understand. Again, referring back to the relevance of Lenin, as again one of my other influencers always say, Kevin Anderson always says that uh, if we are to assess Lenin's contribution to Marxism in today's time, we have to think of Lenin's theoretical works as a whole, and we have to also understand that that those productive years between 1914 to 1917, when he was reading Hegel's Science of Logic, the Russian Revolution was happening, and everything else was happening around that point of time, how that period of time, that immensely revolutionary or immensely contradicting period of time, can serve as an example of our current crisis. Because we all know that Marxism needs a crisis to sort of re-engage itself with the world in a revolutionary way. It's always there, but it needs to re-engage with popular upsurges, with popular events, with popular uprisings. And so if we focus on that period and focus on the dialectical development of Lenin's theories, we can gain a lot from that. I think with that, I would like to end it. Thank you. Thank you all.
Am I audible? Okay, thank you, Suddhabrata, for your presentation on the revolutionary. Now uh, now I would like to request all the participants to ask if they have tips or about him. So please, everyone, I especially request to ask. And student, if any question can ask. Have in our interaction. So has given his students, if you have any questions. Anyone, any students, if you have any type of question, you can ask. Students, you are requested to ask question. And I also request other faculty, if you have any type of query, you can ask. What happened? No question or what? Hello, students. If you have any type of question, you can ask. Don't waste the time. If they don't have any question, I have one question. Not question. I just wanted to know the idea on it. Sir, can I ask? Hello.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Okay, so, sir, actually, one student, she has just messaged that how Lenin influenced Indian revolutionaries. So, one student, her name is Moidongnyam, and she has messaged that how Lenin influenced Indian revolutionaries. So, I think
Yeah,
you can answer.
yeah. So, see, Lenin's contribution to Indian Revolution, and by Indian Revolution, I think somebody's mic is on. Okay. Yeah. So by Lenin's contribution to Indian Revolution, I'm hoping that she means the Indian freedom struggle. See, the point was Lenin sort of he like it's a very difficult as well as a very ambiguous question to answer, because Lenin actually said sort of very little about India as a country, but rather he had a huge sort of interest, and he showed a huge interest in national liberation struggles. And especially when we consider his ideas on national liberation struggles and how he sort of marshaled Soviet forces, as well as intellectual rigor towards the analysis of national liberation in different colonies at that point of time. And that's why I said that his understanding of national liberation struggles was a highly dialectical one, because Lenin didn't actually just talk about national liberation struggles in terms of just driving away the colonizing forces, but Lenin actually talks about national liberation struggles in terms of driving out the colonizing forces, making an alliance with the bourgeois with the nationally progressive bourgeois for driving out the colonizing forces, and then go on to replace a worker state, a proletariat international state, and then go on towards establishing communism, or establishing a socialism, then on towards communism, because Lenin's conception of revolution was an uninterrupted revolution in comparison to whatever people make of him. His concept of revolution was a very uninterrupted revolution. And so he didn't stop at sort of just freeing India. He instead he put that idea in the through dissemination of ideas about national liberation struggles and dissemination of all these revolutionary ideas. He actually instilled this very concept that freedom doesn't always mean freedom from colonizers, as the Indian revolutionary Bhagat Singh said. And if I'm guessing, I won't make any reference back to history, but if people have watched this movie called The Legend of Bhagat Singh, and if you go back to the last sort of because documentary evidences are enough about this the intellectual influence or the revolutionary influence of Lenin on Bhagat Singh. But if we just go on the popularly accepted or the popularly witnessed sort of explanation, Bhagat Singh while in his jail was actually reading about Lenin, and that's a true incident. Bhagat Singh was reading about Lenin, and so when Bhagat Singh was talking about national liberation struggles, he wasn't talking about just freeing India from the colonizing forces, but rather he was talking about establishing a socialist workers or a socialist uh, worker state or a communist worker state. Because if you remember that statement from Bhagat Singh, because when I talk about Lenin and his influence on Indian revolutionary movement, I always sort of try to analyze him with reference to what Lenin was saying at that point of time, was Roy and other, what the debates were happening in the Third International at that point of time, and what was happening in India, specifically the activities of the Hindustan Socialist Republican Association. So if you see those, you will see that there is a sort of revolutionary sort of connection which is there, a dialectical connection which is there, when Bhagat Singh was talking about that it doesn't mean that we'll give out rule, that will just freedom doesn't mean the replacement of the white rulers with the brown rulers, but freedom means the replacement of any sort of ruler with a democratic system which is governed and which is mediated or which is controlled by the workers and peasants of India. And I think that intellectually, that in my opinion, that is one of the most fundamental ideas that Lenin gives. And that is why that we see even the left-wing struggles in today's day in India, in all popular struggles. The fundamental idea is not just is not just the replacement of the ruler, but rather it's a replacement or an abolition of this concept of ruler itself. We don't need any rulers today. Yeah, I think that sort of answers the question.
I think she is satisfied with her answer. And now I think one student again, he has messaged and he has another question. He was telling that in post-independence India, there was one communist party, and right now we have several communist parties. So how they maintain Lenin ideology? He has a doubt. That's next question, I think.
It's not an. I don't think there is a very Leninist sort of argument to explain that, because Lenin was all for unity, because Lenin never advocated a break within sort of a left-wing movement. Of course, he was opposing the Mensheviks during the Bolshevik Revolution, but as far as I have read Lenin, I have always found him to be somebody who was always talking about uniting the entire working class and uniting everybody and taking forward. And that is, I think, especially if we consider the contemporary situation, I think a lot of socialist and communist parties or a lot of left-wing organizations in India are doing that. They are trying to build alliances, because we have to understand that where the differences lie. It's not that communist parties are not exactly sort of petty right-wing parties which sort of divide themselves on the question of narrow egoism. Communist parties get divided on issues of how do they characterize or how do they go ahead with the question of a revolution in India, or how do they go ahead with the analysis of the Indian state. So based on that, I think, and I have said this before as well in one or two public events as well, that the unity of the left-wing forces in India, if we have to go back to Lenin, it has to be on the basis of a strong dialectical relationship where this idea about the totality, that's, in my opinion, this universality, this universal idea of an Indian revolution, and the particular events on which, or the particular activities based on which they form alliances, that dialectics has to be mentioned, that the dialectical connection has to be established. And once the dialectical connection is established, then we can go ahead to build further alliances. But in the case of why there is a present division, I think, in my opinion, that division just reflects the diversity of Marxist thought. But yeah, of course, nobody wants a divided left. But I think in a country as large as India, seeing the practical real politics scenario, I don't think we can also avoid that thing, because the realities, the mediated reality of everybody is different, and that also is the same for organized collective identities like communist and socialist parties. So in India, I don't think we can actually sort of ever have an unified communist party. In my opinion, that's a very unrealistic dream to be had. I would be very happy to be proved wrong, but at the present juncture, I think that's a very unrealistic dream, because the realities of in India, there are multiple realities, and those realities have to be related dialectically at some point of time. And I think that's because it's a longer engagement. But I think in short, this should sort of give you an indication of how to think about the answer or the question.
Thank you, sir, for your nice answer. I think student might be satisfied with the answer. And me too, I am agree with your same point. And request again, if any questions from your side, the students or faculty, anyone, please, yeah, you can ask the question. I think it will be better if you just come and just show your face and you can ask. I think it will be better instead of just texting in the mail box. Anyone? No question? Anyone? Just give 1 or 2 minutes. Please ask question. If you have any type of question, you can ask. Uh, I think they don't have any questions. So I just wanted to have the last question. Not the question. I just wanted to know. Actually, if you see, sir, you are audible. Hello.
Yeah, you are audible.
Okay. 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 So my question is, if you see, Lenin philosophy is for working class and other unprivileged sections of the society, then why Soviet Union broke down and right now such type of communist role is not existed? So that's a simple question, I think. Shall I repeat again?
No, basically, if I understand the question is like, why does the Soviet Union doesn't exist today if Lenin's ideology was all good, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. That's a common question, so it's okay. So yeah, so one of the main problems which gave into post Lenin, because how we differentiate between post Marxists, we also need to differentiate between post Leninists, because I think one of the fundamental problems was that post Leninists didn't much engage with this idea that I was talking about, this centrality of contradiction. So once the Soviet Union was established, I wouldn't like to go into a debate about the Soviet Union and Stalin and Trotsky at this point of time. But one of the major problems with the Soviet Union, as well as modern day China to be exact, one of the central problems was that this issue that they completely dissolved this idea that there can be a contradiction even after a successful socialist revolution. Mind you, I'm not calling that the revolution wasn't socialist. I'm just saying that even after a socialist revolution, there can be an existent contradiction. And if you don't sort of address that existing contradiction, there is a possibility that you may still end up in trouble. And I guess it's a very simplistic, but I think in a nutshell, like if we are to summarize the problems of Soviet Union in one sentence, I think that's how it is. that there was a tendency which sort of said that the dialectics or the contradiction, the centrality of contradiction is dissolved. So right now we have had a revolution, so it's done. Everything is good. So right now what we need to do is we just need to increase our capacities because the social contradictions have dissolved. But since that dialectical mode of thinking sort of went off after Lenin died in 1924, I think that was one of the main problems why this entire issue about Soviet Union not existing today. Had Lenin lived on, I have no doubt that had Lenin lived on till another 10 or 15 odd years, Soviet Union would still be there today. Because the differences between Lenin and post-Lenin Leninists are immense. They're huge. So it's something like what would have happened if Marx completed that fourth volume of Capital. I think it's a question like that. What would happen if Marx had completed his fourth volume of Theories of Surplus Value? Because it's 3 volumes of Capital, there is an intrinsic qualitative difference between the first volume of Capital that Marx wrote and the second 2 volumes that Engels edited, and the fourth volume that's most famously attributed to Kautsky. So I think that is the question, that somehow you dissolve the centrality of the dialectical contradiction in the society, and once you dissolve it, you actually end up in a state of happiness that I think that philosophers like Zizek call that it's an useless state, and you sort of stop going forward, and you rather remain stagnant, and that stagnancy becomes the death of you in times to come. I think, yeah, does that answer?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for your answer. I hope any other question from audience or participant, please, you can ask. Otherwise, it seems that there's a always interaction between him as resource person and it doesn't look behind. I hope there will be other questions. And we are okay. I think one question came. Yeah, Tamzan, he asked one question and he was saying that October Revolution took place in the year 1917 and Lenin soon into power of USSR. And that time Spanish flu occurred and Russia was also affected by Spanish flu. So how Lenin tackled the pandemic? So his question is,
Honestly, that's a very historical question.
yeah,
Not exactly, I can't go into details, but I can surely uh, lend up sources for people, like sources on which you can exactly look into it. One of the important sources then people can look on is that to answer that this particular question is the role of biotechnology. Now, this is I just posted it in the chat box. It's something by Marxist epidemiologist, like a Marxist epidemiologist, Rob Wallace talks about. Also, there are interesting works from people like George Monbiot on how did Spanish flu and pandemics and all that. There's a Marxist interpretation of pandemics as well. If we look at some of the ideas called disaster capitalism and all that, but that's specifically, this is a very historical question. So I think it will be best suited if you consult, if Mr. Longchar consults some history documents or some of the documents from old biotech archives somewhere, because I'm sure people have talked at length about this. Being a sociologist, I think I'll be doing injustice to them if I talk about what they did. But yeah, that paper that I posted, that's a good enough introduction to the
yeah.
biotechnological development of Soviet Union under Lenin.
Okay, okay, sir. So I think, Tamzan, you have to refer to the history for knowing your answer in more details. And thanks, sir. You have covered up the session in a very nice way. And now I think I have to wind up. And okay, actually, my room is very dark because no current with the inverter. I'm just managing. Okay, so now is the time to say vote of thanks to all the members. Especially thanks our principal of St. John College and the authority of St. John College. and all the faculty who have participated for this webinar, and the faculty of Sociology department, my colleagues, of department and others department who has participated. And I especially thanks Mr. Gupta, for whom we were able to contact our resource person, Mr. This is all about this program. We are very happy. We really know of the dialectics and his revolutionary ideas from our resource person, and we hope he will be there with us in the coming days. And with that, I would like to just conclude the program. And thank you so much, all. If any mistake done by our department, please forgive us. And thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, sir, once again for your for your coming into the program. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I hope to see you in person soon. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, student, you can just log out now, and there will be live streaming. You can, Sir Zongboy, he has also done the live streaming. You can just go to that also. Thank you so much.